she's bringing her micro level experience to macro level work now, beginning master's study in climate policy at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada in September 2020. So thank you so much, Anne, for being willing to speak to us, and the floor is yours. Go ahead. Thanks a lot. You're muted.
Hello, thank
Sorry,
you, Jenny, and thanks everybody for joining us. We're good. Everyone can hear me, see me?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So I am going to get this set up and okay, so like Jenny said, oh, hold on a second. Oh, sorry, just a moment. And like Jenny said, I'm a member, we're all members, most of us here, many of us, Jenny, several of us. Anyway, are members of Ann Arbor Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a local branch of an international organization whose mission is to build political will for a more livable world. Tonight, I'm going to discuss pollution pricing as a tool to achieve climate justice, like Jenny said. So in terms, let's just all get on the same page about by defining what we mean, defining what our terms and looking at the context of climate change in Michigan currently and in the future. In terms of what the main impacts will be, are currently in Michigan and increasing, will be several. So first, increased rainfall and flooding. 2, increased risks to the Great Lakes. 3, public health risks, impacts to agriculture, changes to our forests and ecosystems. And just to take them one by one, in terms of
Hey, Anne.
Yes.
Can I interrupt for a sec?
Go ahead.
We can see the
you can see
view, but not the slides themselves.
Great. So in terms of increased rainfall and flooding, we're going to see what we're seeing. I mean, I don't explain too much, but what we're seeing and we'll see more of is very heavy rain events. So think of the heaviest 1% of storms. They currently drop 31% more precipitation in the Midwest than they did 50 years ago. These events, like Midland, are leading to more flooding, erosion, runoff into our waterways, and are decreasing water quality. More intense storms are resulting in negative impacts on things like transportation, agriculture, human health, infrastructure, especially in the midst of a pandemic. The next set of impacts we're seeing, and we'll see more of, Great Lakes and related risks. So we have rapid transitions between high and low water levels being the new normal. Heavier rainfall is increasing runoff from farms and cities, which leads to more nitrates, phosphates, E. coli, and other pollutants. So think of the Lake Erie algae bloom. And that's sort of the lay of the land there. And increased temperatures mean reduced ice cover in the winter on the Great Lakes, which allows more evaporation to occur, causing further lake level decline. So climate change is also changing the range and distribution of certain species of fish, allowing more invasive species and degrading beach health. On the next of our list, public health risks, especially to children and senior citizens. So in recent years, the number of heat waves has almost tripled compared to the long-term average, resulting in more heat-related deaths and illnesses. Then warmer temperatures make air quality worse, exacerbating allergies with longer pollen seasons, allowing vector-borne diseases like West Nile to spread, and asthma. So, and we're gonna see, as we see increased flooding, that brings the risk of water-related illnesses from sewage and septic failures and toxic algal blooms again. And in terms of agriculture impacts, we'll see a decrease in agricultural productivity overall. For example, cold springtime events can decimate fruit crops like it did to the tart cherry crop in 2002 and again in 2012. And like we had in May, cold air outbreaks in the spring are projected to continue, which further wreaks havoc. And in terms of forests and ecosystems, Michigan's composition of forests is expected to change as rising temperatures drive habitats for many tree species and other species of all sorts northward. Heat stress is impacting some of Michigan's unique tree species and forests, and then there's an increase in invasive species of insects, for example. Hopefully we won't see those hornets, but that's an example. So next, to talk about environmental justice. So when we think about environmental justice, a really great example is the Flint water crisis. So residents of low-income and minority communities were disproportionately burdened by environmental contamination and health risks. You know, there was a 2019 study from the School for Environment and Sustainability at University of Michigan, and it really perfectly illustrates the state of environmental justice or environmental racism or injustice in Michigan. It found that the US Census tracts, and certain ones in Detroit, Grand Rapids, Flint, Saginaw, Lansing, and Kalamazoo are the environmental justice or injustice hotspots in Michigan. These are the red areas on this map, and the darker, the redder the color, the more health risks are present for that community. So what they did was they looked at 11 environmental hazard indicators and 6 demographic indicators that make the community at higher risk. And a higher score means the community has both a high risk of exposure to environmental burdens like air pollution, traffic, and a high vulnerability to social factors like poverty and employment. And then you add, for example, the stress of a pandemic and deep economic recession, and environmental justice, like climate change, serves as a threat multiplier for the most vulnerable populations pre-pandemic and even in a good economic times. On its own, climate change doesn't cause these issues, right? It exacerbates the underlying problems in societies around the world, which makes it, like I said, a threat multiplier. You know, think of a threat multiplier having, like, think of the example of being in a hot car, for example, and having a heated discussion. It just makes everything worse, makes an uncomfortable situation much worse. So we've discussed the impacts of climate change in Michigan. We've discussed the context of environmental justice in Michigan. The next area, you know, to focus on in this discussion is climate justice, and to focus in on what climate justice is, what it looks like, what it means, is to look at the example of Detroit. There's a zip code in Detroit, 48127, that has been, you know, over the course of over a decade, either the most polluted zip code or the top 3 most polluted, top 10 in the country, or top 3 in Michigan over the past decade. It's in Southwest Detroit, and what we see for this community, that the combinations of environmental racism and justice, climate change and social justice just combine to be a perfect storm of risks and burdens for that community. So there in 48127 in Southwest Detroit, there's a refinery, 2 power stations, a steel mill, and a sewage treatment plant within a 5-mile radius. This community bears multiple environmental health burdens. So what we see, what we see in this community are extremely high cancer rates, extremely high levels of air pollution with high levels of asthma-inducing ozone. It's not surprising thus that the asthma rate here in that community is more than double the Michigan average. And remember that, oh, I think I just drew, didn't I? Remember that asthma is one of the immune compromising conditions that increases a person's risk of contracting and suffering with COVID-19. The other impacts, the other environmental health burdens in that community are high traffic proximity and volume. They're right by the Ambassador Bridge. They have a really high number of hazardous waste facilities, 281. They've got a large number of Superfund sites that were former industrial sites. And so that's the context of, you know, that's happening in the background. And the in terms of social justice and economic justice for that same community, generally when Detroiters turn their lights on, air conditioning or heat, they're inadvertently contributing to their climate stress because DTE is heavily dependent on fossil fuels for energy and heating. Next, heat stress is one of the biggest climate change impacts in Detroit. A 2012 study from the University of Michigan noted that from 1980 to 2010, Detroit's average annual temperature has increased by 1.4 degrees Celsius, whereas the average annual temperature for Ann Arbor only increased by 0.2 degrees Fahrenheit over that same period. So extreme heat events will increase, and the most vulnerable in Detroit, whose communities have more health impacts and environmental pollution, also have less tree canopy and more concrete, which are impervious surfaces, creating the heat island effects that contribute to that differential in average temperatures. The more concrete you have, the less trees, the hotter it gets, even when controlling for other factors. And extreme heat is more dangerous for the elderly, for children, and for communities that are already vulnerable. The other climate impact in Detroit is increased rainfall and flooding. So increased rainfall presents two problems for Detroit. First, when storms drop lots of rain and the sewer system can't keep up, stormwater and sewage is dumped into the Rouge and Detroit rivers. Since 2011, Detroit's stormwater management has made it one of the largest sources of pollution in the Great Lakes system. The other effect of increased rainfall is household flooding, which is made more severe because Detroit's housing stock is older and includes more porous concrete. And then also the homeowners tend to be lower income and can't afford to flee their home or repair it. So then the last, in climate justice aspect we see in Detroit is the fact that Detroiters pay 2 times more of their household income on energy than other Michigan residents, which of course leaves them less money for healthcare during a pandemic or to treat the environmental induced health issues like asthma or cancer. And of course, less money to deal with this heat stress and increased rainfall from climate change. So from there, we've set the stage to look at carbon pricing or pollution pricing, carbon pollution pricing or carbon pricing, and how it can mitigate climate change effects, particularly how it would impact the community we've been discussing. So when we look at carbon pollution pricing or carbon fee and dividend, let's define the terms again. When I said mitigation of climate change, excuse me, mitigation, sorry. Is defined, sorry. Note to self, have water handy. Okay, so when we're talking about mitigation and climate change, what we mean is the UN International Panel on Climate Change defines mitigation as human intervention to reduce the sources or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases. In other words, slowing or stopping climate change. Sorry. So when we look at carbon fee and dividend, one of the benefits, one of the advantages that it provides are thus: fossil fuels are artificially cheap at the consumer end or at the pump, for example. And that includes the tax breaks given to the fossil fuel industry. And conservative estimates of those tax breaks are 20 billion per year. Of that, 20% goes to coal, 80% to natural gas and crude oil. That price at the pump, of course, it doesn't include the costs to society of environmentally dependent health problems, like we discussed, asthma, cancer rates, etc. The cost of oil spills, the government costs of cleanup of Superfund and brownfield sites, which are locations where industries have closed down and there are still toxic chemicals and byproducts that remain. And typically governments have to foot that bill at the end. So this price at the pump, sorry, doesn't include any of the true long-term and deeper, much harder to correct problems that fossil fuels create. So now, I'm so sorry. Yes. Gosh. Give me a moment. All right. So anyway, and the thing that I found really interesting was that fossil fuel pollution can even impact things you wouldn't think of, like crop yields and developmental delays in children, for example. And there's even some research that indicates that ozone has a role to play in cardiovascular disease, which is huge. So, and remember in this context that fossil fuels and their effects, their negative effects, are most borne by the folks who can least afford to deal with them and whose carbon footprint is the smallest. So the other benefit of taking an approach like carbon fee and dividend is think of it like the sin tax approach. So where you add a tax, where governments add a tax or a charge to discourage the use of a certain product or to deal with the problems that using that product creates. So think of, New York and other cities who have instituted plastic bag grocery fees in order to decrease plastic pollution. And think of cigarette taxes or congestion pricing, which is a demand tax of sorts, where you might pay more on utility bill if you use a lot of electricity during certain busy times of the day. And it's used in a variety of settings. So it can be used in something like bus services, phones, railroads, to sort of reduce congestion at popular times. So the third benefit of a carbon fee and dividend is thinking of the climate impact. So the communities that are already overburdened are the least. Climate change is a multiplier of these pre-existing conditions, if you will, right? Of the environmental racism or injustice that we've already talked about. The other benefit of a carbon fee and dividend is that it's a way to level the energy playing field and support competitiveness of greener energy. So that has health benefits. It could support economic recovery in the midst of the recession, and greener and cheaper and more reliable energy, because let's be real, DT is no panacea, supports community resilience. So that's something that folks are really focused on now is, preparing. Resilience is crucial because we can't prevent disasters, right? We can certainly be better prepared for them and more resilient to them. So when we look at carbon pricing, for example, there are some there's places, it's a common tool that countries and some states even use, and it's worked before and it's really benefited. So if we look at the case of Sweden, it's probably got the highest carbon tax in the world, approximately $135 a ton. It was put in place in 1991, and by 2000 emissions were down 20 to 25%, a large share of which was attributed to the carbon tax. And my favorite example is not technically a carbon tax, but a carbon price, but the acid rain program was the first major cap and trade program in the US. And cap and trade is, carbon pricing and cap and trade are very similar. So we've done it. The acid rain program was passed by Congress in 1990 to reduce emissions of sulfur dioxide, which were causing acid rain, and it achieved the targeted reductions 3 years ahead of schedule and under the cost. And it was quite a successful thing that I personally remember growing up hearing about. And then in terms of specifics, Citizens Climate Lobby supports the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, HR 763. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that and explain how it works. It's a carbon fee and dividend, like I said, and there are four main parts to the bill. The first part is a carbon fee. So it puts an additional fee on fossil fuels. It starts low at $15 per ton, which is equivalent to 15 cents extra a gallon for a gallon of gas. And it grows by $10 per ton every year. The fee is paid by fossil fuel producers at the point of extraction, so at the oil well, the coal mine, point of entry, which makes it cover all the emissions in our economy. The second part is the carbon dividend. So all of the money collected from the carbon fee is pooled, split into equal shares, and paid directly back to households who spend it however they like. So every adult gets one share and every child gets a half share. Studies show that low and middle income families, the folks who, low and middle income families, the folks whose communities we've been discussing tonight, would really come out ahead, as they would get more in their monthly dividend than they're paying out in at the upfront costs. The more you reduce your carbon footprint, the more dividend you can keep. The third part is the border carbon adjustment. To protect US manufacturers and jobs, goods we import from countries that don't have an equivalent price will pay a fee at the border based on their carbon intensity. So likewise, exported goods to those countries get a rebate of the carbon fee. This means that manufacturers would not be incentivized to relocate overseas where it's cheaper to pollute. And it also incentivizes other countries to implement their own carbon price rather than paying a fee to the US. The last part of the bill is regulatory adjustment. So the bill preserves effective current regulations like auto mileage standards and those related to air and water quality, but pauses the EPA authority to regulate CO2 emissions for the first 10 years after the fee is enacted. If emissions targets are not being met after 10 years, Congress directs the EPA to regulate those emissions in order to meet the targets. The policy's price on pollution will lower carbon emissions far more than existing and pending EPA regulations. And it could achieve the year 2030 goals of the Clean Power Plan within 4 years. And then the other benefit of HR 763 is that it's progressive. So this graph shows the impact of carbon dividends on family outcomes by income decile. The lowest income families will see a net benefit. This is because the poor already have a much lower carbon footprint than the more wealthy, and with equal dividends, like I said, they'll receive more in their monthly rebate than they're paying out. And so in summary, HR 763 supports climate justice in the following ways. One, it mitigates climate change. It will reduce carbon emissions by 40% in 12 years, by 90% by 2050, and that lessens the environmental health burden on the most polluted communities. HR 763 reflects the true costs of fossil fuels, and their increased cost will make greener energy more competitive and scaffolds the complete transition to a low carbon economy. Costs required to transition to a low carbon economy are more distributed, and they don't necessarily fall harder on the most vulnerable communities. Over time, HR 763 achieves its goal and less fossil fuel is used. And over this time, dividends will gradually shrink. But this won't be a hardship because meanwhile, fossil fuel powered products will reach the end of their useful lives and will be replaced by those powered by less expensive, cleaner energy. Carbon taxes without dividends, for example, those in France and Germany, have increased the cost on the poorest communities, which is both unfair and can make them very unpopular. For example, look at the Yellow Vest movement in France and elsewhere, or at least in France, it started as a response to a carbon tax that made gasoline prices higher. So the benefit of HR 763 is that it combines the carbon price with the dividend. So really offsetting and shouldering that burden so that folks who can least afford it are not further burdened. The other benefit of HR 763 is that it's progressive versus regressive. Carbon footprint is correlated with income. You know, the average carbon footprint of the wealthiest households is over 5 times that of the poorest. The majority of households will break even or come out ahead, particularly those at the low end of the income spectrum. And since HR 763 covers only the combustion or burning of fossil fuels, it can be combined with other legislation to target inequities that vulnerable communities face. For example, legislation that addresses the health impacts or cleanup of fossil fuel pollution can be paired with HR 763 to protect frontline communities that live near refineries, coal mines, etc. And that is my piece of the presentation this evening. Let's see.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Anne. That was wonderful presentation, and thank you so much.
Didn't choke to that.
Yeah, probably, there was a lot of comments about this is a bad allergy time, so thank you for pushing through. So